I'm George Galloway. Thank you for supporting my Patreon page. I want to talk to you in this episode about the American war on Cuba. Almost 60 years now, the United States has maintained a posture of unremitting hostility, embargo, subversion, invasion, assassination, and the harboring of terrorists on American soil in South Florida, in Miami in particular, which had as its purpose the perpetrating of vile terrorist acts that would be condemned if they were happening anywhere else in the world. Indeed, we'd have a war on terror against them. I've been associated with Cuba for a very, very long time, all of my life, really. I was just coming to consciousness at the time of the Cuba Missile Crisis. I remember being extremely worried that the world was going to come to an end over a small island called Cuba. As it happens, I was extremely fortunate to get to know one of the belligerents in that crisis, Fidel Castro, spending hundreds of hours in his company and being his biographer in a light way in the Fidel Castro handbook just behind my chair here. I have traveled to Cuba more times than I can remember. I love it. I love its culture. I love its people. And I love its revolution and its achievements. I love its internationalism. The fact that Cuban soldiers, volunteers, were ready to leave their bones on African soil, on Caribbean soil, to defend other people. In some cases, people not very much poorer than they were themselves. But of course, it's not just about the military in Cuba and internationalism. When there's a disaster in the world, an earthquake, a flood, some kind of natural catastrophe, it's the Cuban doctors that are there first. Throughout Latin America, Cuban medical personnel are curing people of blindness and other ailments, illnesses, diseases. It is the best example of internationalism anywhere in the world today. And of course, a Cuban child will live longer than an American child. That's quite a chilling statement to make about America, the richest and most powerful country in the world. But a Cuban child is less likely to die before it's 1 year old, and it will live longer, much longer, actually, in some demographics, in some cities in the United States, than the people in the US will. And Cuba is a third world country. It is not just curing blindness, it's curing ignorance. Education is entirely free in Cuba, from the kindergarten up to PhD level at any age in every university. The cultural level of the Cuban people is higher than any other people in the world. It's not many places where you can hardly get into the National Ballet for ordinary workers and peasants queuing to get tickets, which are, of course, extremely cheap indeed. And as one billboard in Cuba says, and I've never forgotten it, there are 110 million children in the world who go to work instead of going to school. Not one of them in Cuba. The Cuban achievements in terms of biotechnology, in terms of medical science, in terms of their entirely free health service, have become legendary across the world for those that had eyes to see and were prepared to use them. Yet still, Cuba is a blind spot for the American political class. And there was no need for it at all. The revolution, which triumphed on New Year's Day of 1959, was never intended to be a communist or even socialist revolution. It was a patriotic revolution, a nationalist revolution. All it wanted was to end the decades of subjugation of the Cuban people at the hands of the very worst of Americans. Cuba was but a bordello, a casino for the American political classes and the American politicians they had corrupted. And the Cuban people didn't much care for the Jim Crow apartheid system in America because, of course, a very large number of the Cuban people are black. And at the time of the revolution led by Fidel Castro, those black people, just like in the United States, could not go into a public park that was reserved for white Cubans, could not go and stand at the next urinal in a public lavatory that was reserved for white Cubans, could not dine in the same cafes and restaurants as Cuban white people. And that system of apartheid was one of the first to go. The owners of the bordellos and the casinos and their hangers-on, of course, fled the island after the triumph of the revolution. And they have not rested for one day in trying to compel American policymakers to support their cause of getting their bordellos back, getting their casinos back, taking back the buildings that are now schools, clinics, hospitals, and returning them to the gold-toothed emigres in South Florida. They first prevailed upon the administration of President Eisenhower to prepare the Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba, an invasion that took place under the presidency, early days of the presidency of John F. Kennedy, which is often called a fiasco, but that's just another way of saying that the Cuban people repelled all borders. They drove out the invaders and their American controllers and secured the revolution on the island. And that revolution has been secure ever since because its achievements have earned it the loyalty, fealty of the vast majority of the Cuban people, who are dollar poor. That's true. They don't have much hard cash in their pockets, but they do have a free health service, a free education service, a free, untrammeled access to the country's cultural riches, its sporting excellence, and all the other wonderful things about Cuba. There may be, probably are, no plans to repeat the Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba because that would make the invasion of Iraq look like a picnic. 10 million Cuban people have weapons, and 10 million of them would use them until the death. And that's not something the American armed forces can afford to test. But what has continued throughout all these decades is the attempt, driven by the gusanos, as they're called, the Cuban emigre community in South Florida, but elsewhere too in the United States, to bend American public policy to their will. That takes the form of the ongoing economic war, for that is what a blockade is. It's defined in international law as an economic act of war. And Cuba has been facing that blockade ever since, very soon after the triumph of the revolution on New Year's Day in 1959. That means that the Cuban people cannot buy from their closest neighbor just 90 miles away, cannot sell to their closest neighbor just 90 miles away. But it's much more serious than that. Since the so-called Helms-Burton Act, America has asserted its right of extraterritorial law over all the other countries of the world, so that, for example, the United States government can and does sue companies in France, in Britain, all around the world for trading entirely legally, according to its own legislature, with Cuba. And a ship that pulls in at a Cuban port may not pull in to an American port for many months, perhaps years afterwards. People who sell even medical equipment, for example, to Cuba find themselves not just blacklisted from American trade, but actually sued in the courts of their own countries by the United States of America. Even the Cuba Solidarity Campaign here in Britain had its bank account closed by the laughingly called Cooperative Bank under instruction from the United States of America, even though the Cuba Solidarity Campaign is an entirely legal British organization with the support of scores of British lawmakers, parliamentarians, and not just of one party either. It really is a monstrous situation, and that's before you factor in the hundreds of efforts made by the American state, yes, the state itself, to murder the Cuban president, Fidel Castro, now deceased. That's before you factor in the terrorism that I spoke of earlier, which has hijacked airplanes, shot down civilian airliners, left bombs in hotel foyers and in public places in Cuba, ready to murder and maim anybody who happened to be there on holiday, or any innocent Cuban who happened to be in Cubana Airways office when it was bombed, not in Cuba even, but in Mexico City. There's no need for any of this. If Donald Trump can hug, and I mean hug, Kim Jong-un in North Korea, thousands of miles away, why can't he even shake hands with the new president of Cuba, who isn't even called Castro? Just one more thing. The most notorious, the blackest spot on America's international reputation over the last 15 years or so has been the torture camp at Guantanamo Bay. Where is Guantanamo Bay? It's in Cuba, literally a part of Cuba. How come the Americans have built a torture camp there? Because America illegally occupies Guantanamo Bay. They send a check every year as rent for the base at Guantanamo Bay, and the Cuban government sends it back, along with an entirely legal peremptory demand for the United States to quit Cuban national territory. And every year, the American state refuses to do so. It is really adding insult to the very considerable injury that the United States has perpetrated against the Cuban people and the political system that they have chosen. And it's time for it to be brought to an end. Donald Trump, you'll never be allowed to open a bordello or even a casino in Cuba. But you could have a friendly neighbor instead of one that your country has been perpetually at war with. You can have a friendly neighbor with whom you can trade. You can buy their tobacco. They can buy from you the things that it makes obvious sense for them to buy from you, rather than to buy from Norway or Ireland or Britain or France. You could have normal state-to-state relations with Cuba. Why don't you? Now, I want to make one last point, which is not entirely connected, but which I think I should comment on. The United States has been consumed over the last few days in a liberal paroxysm of sentimentality and grief over children being separated from their parents at the US-Mexico border. And it's good that the American people, big-hearted people, people who understand human suffering when they see it, it's good that people are touched by the plight of illegal refugees into the United States. But I've got to tell you that all this talk of cages really leaves me hot as well as cold. Because the people in Gaza are one big cage. They're in one big cage. And they have children too. Some of whose children are being murdered at the wire fence of the cage, just for protesting at the fact that the cage is there in the first place. And I saw a US television anchor unable to continue her news bulletin. So overcome with weeping was she about the plight of the children in the cages down on the border with Mexico. But the same woman defended Israel shooting Palestinian children in Gaza. And guess what she said on that occasion? Israel has the right to defend its border. Even though actually the fence isn't Israel's border. Israel has no borders. It refuses to define its borders and continues to seek to enlarge them. Why do I mention it in this broadcast? Well, nothing that Netanyahu does, nothing, zero, that Netanyahu does would be possible but for the never-ending largesse in financial terms and in political support from the government of the United States of America, and in particular, the liberals in the United States of America. Yes, the Democrats in the United States of America who love Netanyahu but hate Donald Trump, who love the cage in Gaza but hate the cages on the Mexico border. Go figure. Here's a link to an interview I did with a national hero of Cuba. And to paraphrase John Lennon, that is something to be. He is a member of the Cuban Parliament. He is a national hero officially in Cuba. He's the head of all the international solidarity organizations, which liaises with countries all over the world. And he spent 15 years in an American penitentiary in the land of the free for trying to disrupt and, if possible, thwart the terrorism emanating from South Florida. He's a legend. He's one of the so-called Miami Five, or the Cuban Five. Here's what he had to say about his time in the dungeons of America. Fernando, you were in the United States for at least 15 years longer than you might have wanted to be, because they imprisoned you for reasons I've just explained. Tell us, please, which prisons were you in America, and how did the other prisoners, American prisoners, react to your presence?
Aside from the Miami Detention Center, I was in Oxford, Wisconsin for 5.5 years. I was in Terre Haute, Indiana for another 5 years. And then to my last 2 years, I was in Safford, Arizona, the state of Arizona. And I would say that generally speaking, in any places that we were, and I say that we were because my other four brothers had the same experience, we received respect from the other inmates. Generally speaking, that was the case for each and every one of us. We were individuals that minded our own business. We were not involved in any dynamics, those complex dynamics inside the prisons that create so much trouble. And we were respectful of everybody, and I understand that. I came to think that when you give respect to an individual, then the natural way to respond is giving respect back. Unless the individual is emotionally unbalanced, which you can find in prisons.
You can find that even in the White House.
Right. and that's the reality, man. The case was not very well known. Most of the people didn't get to know why we were, the reasons why we were in prison for. But they understood that we were respectful individuals. They approached us for comments or concerns of trying to get advice on something, especially younger individuals. And that was the situation, respect from and that was even the case in Miami. While we were in the detention center in Miami, where so many individuals there were from Cuban origins, we always had respect. I mean, we don't remember having any trouble with anybody for political reasons.
That's very interesting. Do you think people knew that you were political prisoners?
At the end of our stay in prison, people knew in general terms. They couldn't get into the details, But they knew, in general terms, I mean, because we received a lot of mail, and that calls the attention of the inmates, mail coming from all over the world, that calls the attention of the literature, like newspapers from political parties from different countries, left political parties, socialists or communists, and then people started to wonder, and then some of them, they came straight forward and asked you. And some of the others, they never asked, but they saw the newspaper, they read, and then sometimes the newspaper carried an article on the case. Sometimes it was uncomfortable on those issues of the newspapers that carried information about the case. I didn't disseminate it around because I didn't want to be in a position that it was thought that I was propagandizing my situation with anybody. But people knew, and the Cubans that were with us in prison, that they did know, and they commented with other inmates. So at the end of our stay in prison, I would say that it was fairly known, not in details, but they knew that we were prisoners for political reasons.
You, of course, as none of us do, hate the American people, far from it.
Of course not.
Our gripe is with the policies of successive American governments. In fact, it would be the best possible outcome, wouldn't it, if Cuba and the United States could live as close neighbors in an era of mutual respect?
I mean, the Cuban people and the Cuban Revolution has always wanted good relationships with the United States. I mean, we would never blame the people of the United States for the things that the U.S. government has done to Cuba. We can separate what the government has done for political reasons from the people of the United States. And I can tell you that when my family visited me in prison, they always received, anywhere that I was, they always received the support of American individuals that hosted them, that helped them go to prison, visit me, and then went pick them up and brought them back to where they were staying, or even they stayed at their houses. I mean, people in the United States are decent individuals, people with feelings and very, I would say very humane individuals.
Friendly, big-hearted people.
Big-hearted people. And I can tell you that most of the individuals that supported our families when they visited the United States to go visit us in prison, they were individuals that were not politically conscious. They just did it because they thought it was, this family comes all the way from Cuba to a country that is a foreign country. They don't even know the language, and they're making all this effort to come here to see somebody who's in prison. And out of the goodness of their hearts, they helped our families. Not because they were politically conscious or sympathized with Cuba. It's just because they're good people. They're good people.
Thank you very much indeed for joining us on Windows on America.
Thank you and your audience.